Russian opinion polls seem to defy everything. No matter how bad it gets, the polls just go up when the president needs them to. How is this even possible? Are Russians really warmongers? And why is Putin so popular? Spoiler alert, it's the polls themselves, and I will show you exactly why. But there's a deeper issue here. The polls also contain a trap for people outside of Russia. If you run into it, you will be helping the Russian war effort. Let me explain. A quick disclaimer. I am very much aware of the atrocities that have been committed by Russian soldiers in Ukraine. I have personally heard first-hand accounts from friends that I know for more than a decade, so I am in no way defending Russia's actions. I am merely analyzing the polls and giving you the tools to interpret them correctly. Please keep that in mind. To understand if and how polls are manipulated, we have to first understand how they work. Putin's approval ratings usually range from 60 to 80%. These high approval ratings are something leading politicians in democracies can usually only dream of. This here is the long-term approval rating of Putin according to the polling outlet Levada Center. Here we can see several major shifts of public opinion in the past. See this huge leap upwards? That's when Russia forced all politicians to provide full insight into their wealth to the public. Nah, obviously not. It's the start of the war in Ukraine in 2014. This made Putin's support surge upwards. Putin enjoyed one of the highest approval ratings ever. So does this mean it's high now? You will get an answer, but we have to explore some important stuff first. This big drop here is also very noteworthy. It's a domestic issue. The government had raised the pension age from 60 to 68. That sparked huge protests because people weren't prepared to work an additional 8 years. The protests led to changes in the legislation of the pension age, including some groups getting a softer treatment. There are several more examples on this. So our first conclusion is domestic issues have the potential to lower the approval ratings, and foreign policy issues usually increase approval ratings. There are three major influences that are affecting Russian polling. The first influence, and by far the biggest, is the completion rates. Now don't mix them up with response rates. A response rate is how many people you get to agree to answer your questions. Those usually are between 5 and 15%. Now, Russian Field, a smaller polling outlet, did a series of polls about Putin's approval ratings and various topics around the war. And this is their part of the report where they shed some light on the methodology. It contains an absolute bombshell of data. I've colored the success rate or completion rate in purple. It has halved to about 5% since the outbreak of the war. Let me show you why this completely annihilates any trustworthiness of the numbers themselves. According to Russian Field, about 30,000 people were reached, agreed to answer the questionnaire, and answered the first two questions. What are those questions? In which region are you located, and in which age bracket are you? Russian Field calls these questions the passport questions. These questions are important for polling to reduce bias and get a representative slice of your target group. Then, of those people entering the main question block of the interview, around 95% broke off the interview. That's nearly everybody. Now remember, we are only looking at those around about 5%. If you then get an approval of roughly 80% for Putin and about 14% against Putin, what does that actually mean? Let's zoom out. That's roughly 4% for Putin and about 1% against. The other round about 94 to 95% cancelled the call after hearing the real questions. Can you honestly interpret a huge support for Putin out of that? Russian Field also investigates why people broke off the interview. A full 20 to 25% of all cancellations were because the interviewed person was afraid of talking about these topics. That's 5 to 6 times the amount of people that answered in a supportive way. Now, we must take this with a grain of salt. This specific opinion poll was run for Maxim Katz, who is a Russian politician and an activist in the opposition. He tweeted about his surprise and about how unreliable numbers in Russia are nowadays. His key takeaway is, only the respondents of the polls are represented, and that's a tiny group that is probably heavily distorted. There's another big factor that is pushing the completion rates down, and that is the new update to Article 207.3 in the Russian Criminal Code. Yes, you know which one I mean. If you spread false information about the Russian army, you can be fined huge amounts of rubles or even go to prison. When was this signed? March 4th, a Friday. It took a few days for everybody to grasp what this exactly entails, and in the days afterwards, basically every independent news outlet that was left closed or got closed down. And we can see this in the numbers. Remember those completion rates? They halved after the new updated law came into power. Sam Green, Professor of Politics at the King's College in London, also tweeted about this on April the 1st, mentioning response rates being at half or a third of the usual rates. Even though he is talking about response rates, we can safely assume that the same effect is influencing the completion rates as soon as the participants hear the questions being asked and how dangerous potential answers can be. Again, a grain of salt, Sam Green doesn't seem to be a fan of Putin, but he is a trusted professor, and this is an additional data point for my analysis. We could put a real number on the fear Russians have of the authorities. Levada Center has a very interesting answer to this from 2021. Look what pops up as one of the top anxieties. 77% are very, or at least a bit, afraid of the authorities. That's a bummer. And this number is pre-war, pre-new criminal code, and pre-ramping up of all state media against Ukraine. Remember this. So how many Russians really support the war and Putin himself? We'll get into that, but we're not quite there yet. The second big influence is response validity. The problem here is, does the answer the participant gave really reflect their opinion? Some polls ask straight yes and no questions. Some offer a more neutral way out of the point-blank questions about support. WCIOM, one of the official outlets with alleged strong ties to the Kremlin, uses this method in this question here. Do you support the special military operation in Ukraine? 15% don't support it, and another 9% are undecided. What do the undecided responses actually mean? Alexei Miniailo run several very interesting phone interviews on this. The most interesting one, I think, is about squeezing out the no's. Between March 10th and March 14th of 2022, he had about 1,800 Russians called. When asked about the support for the war, the respondents were split and had two different ways of answering. One group got the point-blank yes or no treatment, and that resulted in 70% yes and 14% no. The other group could opt out of the question by giving a neutral answer. And lo and behold, half of the respondents decided that I don't know might be a safer option. So just by offering a neutral way out, the non-respondents halved from 14 to 7%. And Alexei states that the demographics were exactly the same. Alexei is an activist also on the side of the opposition. By the way, he tweeted a very interesting thread on Putin's faked wargasm. The thread is a real treasure and didn't get enough appreciation. Please give it a read and like it if you feel inspired. It's well worth your time and linked in the description. Another influence is how questions are worded. Remember that poll from the official polling outlet WCIOM? They didn't just ask about your support for the special military operation. There's one word that changes the whole question. They asked about your support for the decision to conduct this operation. Now, who made this decision? Remember that strange TV appearance of Putin where he basically forced his senior staff to clearly state support for a more forceful approach towards Ukraine? Putin taunted with something like, "You are not speaking clearly enough. Do you support or not?" Even though Putin wanted to show the broad support for more force within his senior staff, he actually just showed that it's his view and his decision. So by saying no, are you just saying you don't support the operation, or are you criticizing Putin's ability to make good decisions? The wording matters. Another important detail here is the wording special military operation. This is the official wording, making this question a very official question that could have been asked by an employee of the authorities. How many people will think twice about their answer? Before we get into the real support ratings and my opinion after this analysis, please remember, you are called by a complete stranger at home, and this stranger starts asking some very private and precarious questions. And Russia is not exactly a beacon of free speech. So keep this in mind when pollsters conduct interviews in authoritarian countries right after tight media lockdowns have been imposed. This is not a huge protest with lots of supporting friends where you might be able to run away. You are called at the number registered to your name, and you are all alone with this stranger and his invasive questions. Don't get me wrong, I believe the Russian population has to push for change. So I'm not defending people that are scared to voice their true opinion in a poll that will not be accurate by any standard. I'm just trying to understand how these polls work and convey this to you so you can make your own proper interpretation. So, up to the grand conclusion. How many Russians really support this war? Spoiler alert, I think it's a close call of support versus no support at around 35 to 40%. I'll explain to you why, and we'll get into that trap I talked about at the beginning too. One key thing you must keep in mind: the polls are not there to reflect a precise public opinion. This is not a democratically elected government considering opting out of nuclear energy and because of that wanting a precise analysis of the public sentiment towards nuclear energy. The polls on the support for Putin and the war are about control. Controlling the narrative, controlling trustworthiness. Because if everybody's on Putin's side, then what he says must be right, right? And about controlling dissent. You have to believe that your dissent is a minority opinion, because if you believe that a majority is for Putin and the war, then you'll be less likely to bring it up in a conversation. And if another dissenting citizen starts talking to you about it, you are less likely to support this. After all, it might be, if the majority is on Putin's side, this could just be a test or a trap. So pumping up the public support for Putin and the war is very much a defensive mechanism for when things get tough. Keep that in mind. The only number for dissent that I could find that I would bet on is this one. It's also from Russian Field, that same poll, and it's very cleverly worded. It basically asks, would you cancel the special military operation? Here, 55% wouldn't cancel and 27% would cancel, which is nearly twice the amount that have answered no support for the war in other polls. My guess, a substantial part of the 70% don't knows will also be for a cancellation. Not necessarily all or a majority, but there will be some cancellers in the don't knows. This is an ingenious way of asking. It's a lot less risky because it includes a reasonably defendable position. You could be for the cancellation of the operation because it was so unbelievably successful. So masking your dissent towards the war is a lot easier, and giving a more truthful answer is a lot less risky. Remember, this is the narrative that the opposition wants you to believe, so you could see this poll as biased, but just not towards Putin. But I do think this is a more reliable source than not. So who supports the war? Since this video is getting too long, I'm not going to bore you with lots of stats on this. Having looked at all polls, it's quite clear. There's a substantial rift in Russian society. The older people get, the stronger they support Putin and the war. And I have an explanation for this too. There's a very strong correlation between people seeing the TV as the main source for trusted information and their support for the war. It's very simple to explain. The TV is a closed information ecosystem under full control. And even the programming has been changed, with many channels even leaving out most entertainment content and just going all in with 24/7 political commentary. And you can imagine what that looks like. And on top of that, the older people that have lived in the 80s and 90s, they lived through the final stages of the Soviet Union. They remember rations. They remember that money wasn't that important. It was more about connections and bartering. So to get a doctor's appointment, you might have to throw a salami into the deal. And back then, with rampant corruption, which you could argue is still there, just differently, these people have seen an unbelievable increase of wealth, of healthcare partly, and of living conditions. And of course, they attribute that to Putin, who came into power in the early 90s. And this rift between the old people and the new can be seen very clearly at protests. It was mainly younger people protesting. Remember, 15,000 people were detained, and this also explains the very many anecdotal reports on social media about Ukrainians arguing with older relatives in Russia about the war not happening and civilians not being targeted. Even parents don't seem to believe their own children. I strongly believe that these same rifts exist within Russia itself. Not everywhere, not in the open, but they seem to be there. Especially if we look at how younger people have historically had highly positive views of the EU and the US, and these younger age groups mainly trusting the internet as a main source of information. Just to give you a short, quick feeling for what a complete domination of the media landscape can feel like. This is one of the most popular start pages for Russians, Yandex, the Google of Russia basically. I've auto-translated the news bites right under the search bar. It's all Russian narrative only. And this was taken a few days after the finding of the atrocities in Bucha. All you see here is provocation by Ukraine, murder of Russian prisoners, and the West ganging up on Russia and Russians. Even Kurilla, a professor at the European University of St. Petersburg, made 3 very good points about this. Mass support is designed by surveys, censorship, and propaganda. Many people who support the war just repeat what they hear on TV and media. And the most important point, during the war, the question of supporting the war equals for many to loyalty towards your country. Keep in mind, most people in Russia do not have a full picture if they don't actively go out and seek other information sources that are often blocked. Now, there have been intercepted phone calls of Russian parents telling their sons to loot. They seem to hold some merit, mainly because their Russian had no Ukrainian accents. But these phone calls are very few compared to all the other anecdotal evidence of people in Russia repeating official narratives and not believing even their own relatives. Now, we've all seen pro-Russian content on social media. There are real people supporting Russia on social media, but there are also lots and lots of bots. So don't be fooled by how much support you are seeing. Or, as the rumor goes, a pro-war comment costs Russia about 5 rubles. So don't overestimate the support based on social media activity. And now we come to the trap, attacking the undecided. Now, I'm a random guy on the internet, so don't take my word for it. These are not exact numbers. This is my guesstimate from all the data that I've seen. I have a lot of experience in analysis, but still you should make your own interpretations. Now, in my guesstimate, I think that 30 to 35% don't seem to support the war. Another 35 to 40% seem to support the war, either because they just don't know it better, or because they are really just hardcore Russian pro-Putin nationalists. These people exist, yes. And another 25 to 35% are kind of undecided, but probably will side with the war because they just don't have proper info and don't have a real opinion on it. So the big trap here is the main Kremlin narrative that the West is ganging up on us. That is a big major part next to the whole bullshit about denazifying things and stuff like that. This narrative is confirmed if Russians go out and see in the West that all Russians are generalized into one group, or if they see that Russians are being attacked, be it online or offline. So you have to be very careful when generalizing. Don't do it, because as soon as you give the undecided, or the ones that support the war weakly or barely, if you give them a confirmation by being against them in person without even knowing what they think, that will confirm the Kremlin line, and their decision and their opinion will harden. And then you're helping Russia, you're helping Putin, and you're helping the war effort. So, what can we do? The first thing is stay calm. Concentrate on helping. Seriously consider amplifying Russian opposition, because Ukrainians or foreigners, Westerners, supporting the Western narrative or just many of the facts that are just there, that is just less powerful to an average Russian than if another Russian says that, and if many other Russians say that. So if you find good content from Russian speakers that clearly show the facts and what is happening on the ground, why not amplify them instead of only amplifying the same outside of Russia sources? And last but not least, don't generalize. You're harming more than you're helping. Now, I hope very much that you enjoyed this analysis and that I've inspired you, that you have learned something from it. Consider subscribing. It will definitely show me that you are interested in this kind of analysis. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.